fish should probably be done just as it gets dark, said Samuel. That'll be great, said Averly. I've been looking forward to this all day. She had been, too. They hadn't had a consistent set of meals as lovely as this for as far back as she could remember. Samuel cooked the fish expertly and every night, and was a treat. She began salivating at the smell of cooking fish reached her. The group lounged and rested while the fish cooked and worked out what to do if they got separated while in the forest. Something they were all worried about happening, none of them having ever actually been in the forest before. Well, if it's before the bridge, let's agree to continue on and meet there at the center if we can. And if it's after the bridge, let's agree to meet here towards the end of the forest where the river first cuts back over the pathway again. There should be a small set of 2 bridges there, so it shouldn't be hard to find if we get lost. If you can't see Merlin's sword or the Northern Star, then just make sure that you're on the main pathway and not one of the offshoots, said Barklin, holding the map book out to the others and tracing with his fingers along a few pathways that shot off from the main branch of the trail they were intending to travel along. We'll be able to wait a few days before traveling on if we do get separated, and if you do end up on one of the offshoots, it'll only be about a half day's travel down one way towards the mountains and a couple the other way up towards Tanzeria, and you'll not be able to hear the river after a while, and it shouldn't take you too long to turn back and come the right way round. If we all agree not to leave each other behind, this should work out well if we do accidentally get split up, said Samuel. They each agreed that there was the right course of action, and as Rose sat back in her tent, she asked, "Do you think we'll be able to see the stars from within the forest at all?" She looked at the large trees cresting the horizon. They look awfully large, and if there's enough of them, we may not be able to see the sky whatsoever. It may be spooky in there. Well, we do have torches if that ends up being the case, said Samuel, so it won't be so scary if we do need them during the night, or if it's a particularly dense area of forest and we need to light them up for a while. Since the pathway through the forest is a straight line, and we had the river to guide our direction, this should be a piece of cake, said Averly, sure of their ability to get through the forest unscathed. We've done so well so far. Why shouldn't we be able to handle the next part too? They sat back and thought a while and said nothing. The sky grew dark, and the first beginnings of the night sky became evident. Marlin's sword rose out from the darkening sky as they waited for their dinner to cook. Rowan, who had kept out of sight for the duration of their walk by matching their pace just out of eyeshot and catching up when they camped for the night, sat by a tree and watched the young animals talk about their next part of their adventures with a smile on his mousy face. They were planning out each part of their trip and working together to get where they needed. There hadn't been any bickering or attempts of anyone becoming the de facto leader through force like he had heard from the other followers of the groups that had left off after this one. He had heard that in Topher's group, Bernard and Steiner had been fighting the whole time about who got to walk in front of whom, and no one had been able to get them to calm down and stop it, and had led to a whole lot of bickering from the group, slowing them down considerably. The other 2 sets had done better, but Rowan's group had done and gone the furthest, the fastest, and it made him proud to know that Blake and Elizabeth's son was in that group, and even more so that he was doing a fine job of keeping them level-headed and focused on their next goal with his map book. It was a good thing that he got to bring his books, Rowan thought to himself. It's not often that 4 different species were able to work together so well and so easily. He scrolled a note to send back to Jedediah in the dirt in front of him and wrote a few symbols around it. When he was finished, the symbols faintly glowed briefly, and a puff of blue smoke came up from the ground, and then the note was gone. It had gone through. He got comfortable and settled in for the night. He had caught a fish for himself after watching them do it for days on end, and built a small smoking fire that couldn't be seen from his position, and smoked his fish. He enjoyed it immensely when it was ready and washed it down with the fresh stream water from his water skin. He rested while watching the others talk. He could barely hear what they were saying, but he knew from the cadences that they were having a good night, and that made him feel glad. He sat and enjoyed his full stomach. They spoke at length on what to do once they got out into the forest. It should only take a day to get through it, said Rose. Barklin looked at his map and said, yes, it's a very long forest, but not especially wide where we're passing through, which thankfully makes it easier to get through. The fish is ready, said Samuel, and flipped out their portions onto large hunks of bread from Rose's bag. They had decided to consolidate their rations and work their way through them that way. It was easy considering they were using less than what they had been intended to use from all the fish they were eating. They ate their meal and they spoke about their old classmates. How do you think Topher's group is doing? Asked Rose, concerned about the mouse that was being picked on the last time they had seen one another. Probably being the butt of the others' jokes, Samuel. He always was easy picking since he would get so upset if you jostled him at all. You're probably right, and I bet Joseph has already used most of his arrows on imaginary enemies at this point, joked Barklin. The three of them laughed and Averly smiled. She didn't feel left out of the conversation, but instead felt as though they were treating her as an old friend, as someone that would know about their classmates' personalities and would be in on the jokes they told. It warmed her. I bet Bernard and Steiner are arguing over which one of them gets to go first in line, and they'll probably end up walking at the same pace just to make sure the other one doesn't take the lead, said Samuel. All four of them laughed about the idea of two hares bouncing in front of one another until the pace could be determined. They ate their dinner and retired for the night, smiling from ear to ear, happy with the fact that they weren't like that. Chapter 3. Into the Forest. They woke early in the morning, the mist from the river making it over to their camp and enveloping it. It was cooler by the forest edge than it had been in the lowlands. Averly moved from her tent and shivered. "It's chilly this morning," said Averly. Barkland moved out from his tent and agreed. "You're right," said Barkland, shaking himself, attempting to rid the cold from his body. He went over to the fire and started building it up again. It had gone out completely during the night. Once it was good and hot, he went back to his tent and rummaged around for a minute, coming back out with a small tin pot. He went over to the river and filled the pot and brought it back to the fire, placing it as the fire's edge to warm. While it warmed, he went back to his bag and brought out 4 tin cups and a small pouch of something sweet-smelling. 4 rolls of bread also made their way out of his bag, which he placed by the pot to warm their meal. "Would you like some dandelion tea with breakfast?" Barkland asked. "That would be wonderful," said Averly, shivering again. "That should warm us up pretty quickly this morning. Thank you very much." They sat and waited for the other 2 animals to wake, and Averly asked him how his reading was going. Good. I'm almost done with the history of the areas, so you'll get to borrow that one first if you'd like," said Barkland. She agreed it would be something of a lovely thing to read about. "Here, you can start it now while we wait for the other 2 to wake up," said Barkland, and he went back to his tent and returned momentarily with the small book in his large paw. There's a section on the history of the pirates' lands to the west that I found particularly interesting. It's in Chapter 3 when you get to it. I would love to discuss that with you when you get there. Averly agreed that she would do just that, and thanked him for letting her borrow something as precious as the book. "I'll need it after breakfast, of course, since I've got to look after the maps inside. Every morning I'll bring it back out, and you can read it while at your leisure, while we eat breakfast before we break for camp for the day, and when I'm done, you'll be able to read it at night as well," said Barkland. "That'll be great," replied Averly, and thanked him again. She spent the rest of the morning poring over the map chapter of the book, studying the land she had traveled as a youngling, and finding out where they were traveling in total through the use of the map they were currently using. She came to the section they were at now, at the forest edge, and found his note. Day 4, dinner. She found Barkland's notes endearing and useful, and tracked them back all the way to the first note by the pond. She handed it back to him, and just as Samuel stirred from his rest and popped his head out of the tent. "Is that breakfast I smell already?" he asked. Samuel came out of his tent and shook off the morning's cold himself and plopped down next to Barkland and Averly to warm himself. He had wrapped himself in his blanket from his tent and rubbed his eyes. "I was having this wonderful dream," said Samuel. "We were battling pirates on the open seas, and I was jumping across the deck of one boat to another to meet our foes. It was a lot of fun, swashbuckling like that." Averly and Barkland smiled at one another and silently agreed that he must have overheard their discussion on the pirates chapter of the book Barkland had been reading, that they had been discussing earlier that morning. "Well, Mr. Swashbuckler, would you like some tea with your bread?" "It's almost ready," asked Averly, smiling at Samuel. "Sure, let me just wake up Rose before we get into it. It's always better if we eat together in the morning, then no one's off pace for the rest of the day, and we can start our travel off right," said Samuel. He shivered again, in spite of the blanket and the fire warming him. "I can't believe how cold it is, considering there's not a cloud in the sky. The forest shade must cool the river right down at night to let this mist come out like this." He got up and walked over to Rose's tent to wake her. Rose popped her head out after a moment and said, "Good morning." She was a heavy sleeper and prone to falling asleep first and waking last in the morning, unless it was her turn to make breakfast. Then she was up at the crack of dawn, making sure everyone got fed their proper ration. Samuel moved back into his blanket and threw another thick branch into the fire, which had warmed his blanket while he was gone quite nicely. "Misty morning, isn't it?" said Rose, yawning. They all agreed. "Come on out of your tent and let's have some breakfast, shall we?" asked Barkland. She agreed and came out of her tent wrapped in her blanket, similar to how Samuel had gotten up. It trailed behind her as she walked. She sat down near the fire, and Ailey grabbed a small cloth and pulled the pot from the side of the fire and poured the hot water into the 4 cups. Barkland reached into the small sack he had brought out earlier and sprinkled some dandelion whiskers into each cup and gave one to each of them. "Let it steep for a few minutes to cool, and it should go quite well with the warmed bread from the morning," said Barkland amicably. They sat and held their warm cups while they waited for the tea to settle. Today's the first day of the forest, said Rose, stifling another yawn. Should be an interesting day walking through the woods. I hope the trail is clear. Wouldn't want to have to make our way over any fallen logs or cross the river if we don't have to. It wouldn't be so difficult, responded Barkland, smiling. Maybe not for you, replied Rose, but I would either have to vault over it or walk all the way around the length of it, and that might take ages. Look at the size of them. They're massive. They looked at the trees in the distance. They really were very large, very healthy-looking trees, and if one of them decided to fall on the pathway, even Barkland would have trouble getting over them with how wide the trunks were. Many looked to be more than 10 feet thick and hundreds of feet tall. He agreed with her and hoped none of them decided to make themselves a nuisance to the group if it could be helped. Plenty of wood for fires, though, said Samuel, and the years of leaves falling onto the ground should make for a very comfortable walk and even more comfortable sleeping arrangement. It'd be like nature gave us a mattress to rest on each night. They all agreed that was true, and their moods perked up a bit. Averly stirred her tea with a finger and tried it, sipping gently. Ooh, that really does hit the spot very nicely, said Averly. They sat and ate their bread and drank their tea. Averly asked Barkland if she could study the maps a bit more, and he agreed, handing the book back to her for the time being. She sat there and studied the areas of her childhood home and its surrounding lands, and thought to herself, I'll make it back there again, I promise, before finishing her meal and handing it back to Barkland, who promptly put it in his pouch and tied it around his neck. They started to break down their tents for the day's trek, and Samuel doused and ground out the fires he was taught. Then, taking the towel Averly had used on the mugs, placed the cooled fire pits of rocks in a sack and gave them to Barkland to carry while they traveled. There likely wasn't going to be many stones in the forest, and they needed them to keep the fire in a safe circumference on the forest floor. It might be cool and damp in the forest, but an uncontrolled fire would cause serious damage to the area and possibly themselves. Barkland scooped a pile of dirt from Rose's digging the pit the night before and smothered the remains of the fire once again. Then, for good measure, he poured water from the river back onto the pile, making sure to cool the embers as quickly and completely as possible. Once they were packed up and stretched out, they moved into formation and began their trek into the forest. It was pretty and cool underneath the trees. The pathway was covered in the falling leaves of the massive branches overhead, and they had trouble following it first, but soon were able enough to stay with it easily enough. The pathway made a certain groove in the forest floor that was easy to follow once you figured out how to watch for it. It was also made easier by the fact of the river being on their right side the whole time. As long as they followed the river up until the bridge, they were able to keep sight of the trail itself. The trees were large, and pines and oaks with enough distance between the trunks to let in plenty of light and fresh air. The wind carried the sound of the leaves as they moved back and forth in steady rhythms throughout the day. They would spot occasionally eyes watching them as they passed, and once or twice a black and white bird would fly out from the branches overhead. Their bird song carried over large distances and filled the air with beautiful music. They called out to them once or twice, but the birds never returned their call. It took them most of the day to reach the bridge. It was late afternoon by the time they reached the outcropping, and they decided to make their lunch there by the overpass of the bridge before crossing it. They played in the water, running through the bridge, and jumped from the overhangs into the cool clear water and chased each other over and under the bridge for well over an hour, and then lazed in the sun while drying and resting. Barkland brought out some of their lunch and made some more cool tea from the chilly water. They ate while bathing in the sun and stretched out over the masonry of the bridge. They were having a lot of fun when the bodies that belonged to the eyes that had been watching them stepped out from behind the tree lines behind them, and a circle of raccoons appeared to surround them. "Who are you, and what are you doing messing about on our bridge?" asked the larger of the raccoons. "Nobody said you could come and swim in our swimming spot without asking us." "We're sorry. We had no idea it was your spot at all," said Samuel. We were just passing through and wanted to cool off while we ate our lunch and have a little bit of fun. Sorry if we offended you with our antics." "It's all right," said a smaller female next to the larger male. "Tamas didn't mean anything by it. We were just surprised to see you having so much fun in the water. We weren't expecting travelers by foot, as most animals take a carriage to get around through here." Tamas moved over to the other animals and put out his paw. "It's nice to meet you. I'm Tamas." And pointing to the female raccoon, said, "This is Samsa, my sister. We're the leaders of the Bars and Stripes gang, and it's a pleasure to meet you." Samuel went over and shook the raccoon's paw. "It's a pleasure to meet you too," said Samuel. "Would you like to come with us, and we'll show you the other things that are to do in our forest?" asked Samsa. The group thought it over and decided that since they had made such good time for the day, that it wouldn't hurt to see more of these raccoons' lives. They spoke amongst themselves for a moment before Samuel turned back to the raccoons and said, "Sure, that would be an interesting way to spend the rest of the day. We've never seen a raccoon gang's hideout before, as long as we can get back to the bridge before nightfall, so we can make camp and get on with our journey. We can still have a ways to go, and we can't spend a lot of time off of the trail." Great, said Samsa. We'll make sure you get back in time for your camp out tonight, but we thought we would show you what it's like living in the forest. The raccoons that had been circling them broke into cheers and smiles as they lined up into 2 equal rows, and the travelers, led by the raccoons, made their way into the forest and away from the bridge and into the pathway that led through it. They walked for half an hour before reaching the small outcropping where the raccoons' fort had been constructed. The raccoons brought them in and around the fencing that surrounded the building, being let in by a pudgy raccoon that had been waiting for them to return. "Welcome home," said the pudgy raccoon as he opened the gate. "Anything to report, Elwood?" said Tamas as they passed through. "No, nothing. Happened since you went out this morning, patrol," said Elwood, and then he straightened slightly as Samsa passed. The animals looked at each other and smiled. Elwood was obviously a little worried with Samsa, or at least respected her enough to stand up straight in front of her. His belly wobbled slightly as she passed by him, and he sighed gently as he slouched over again once she and Tamas were safely behind him. The fort was a large log cabin with windows cut deep into the frame of the building and had a small pond next to it, run off from a rivulet dug deep from the river by the bridge. There were smaller raccoons playing in the small pond, splashing around happily with one another. They took no notice of the group's return and continued to play. The raccoons marched them into the cabin, which turned out to be a large dining area with a skylight in the center of the room, filling the cabin with a wonderful sense of light. The room was warm from the day of sunshine, but not unpleasantly hot, as the trees cast shadows into the room through the skylight. There was a large oval table in the center of the room, and the raccoons and the travelers made their ways to it and sat down. Tamas barked out an order for refreshments, and 2 of the younger raccoons from the group made their way to the back of the room, to the kitchen beyond the doors in the back. Glasses could be heard clinking softly as they gathered their wares. Okay, well, I'm taking a break, so I might as well do some ads. This is my first one, so bear with me. So, if you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. That's pretty cool. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. And all you have to do is download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Please visit anchor.fm/divergentmind to leave a message so that I may get back to you. Thank you. Have a nice day. So Anchor is asking me to ask you to support me financially. I would ask that you go to my Patreon to do that, which is patreon.com/divergentmind. It means you can either become a monthly subscriber at a different tier of $1 to $3 to $5. I'm not looking for a lot. I'm not asking for a lot. I'm not asking for anything. This is going to go to the end of my podcast. I don't like it when podcasts straight up ask you for money when I'm doing okay. Well, I'm not doing okay. I'm surviving now to the point that I can make this. I would love to be able to make improvements to this by, say, getting... So basically, I'm running off an iPad, and I would like to improve it by getting different things that would make it better. Maybe some headphones that monitor output, or a better mic. Though the mic I got was from JWife, so I might not even use the better mic. You know what I mean? It's all about whatever I need at the time, but really it's just to get healthy again, because I'm currently over 300 pounds and I don't want to die that young. I would really like to be able to afford some vegetables so I can go back to my vegetarian diet, because being this big sucks. And I'm happy to sit in a chair all day, but I really got to walk my butt off, literally. So that's what the money would be for. It would be for healthy food, because I can't afford it. I can afford ramen and pasta and rice and beans, but I can't live on carbs, because that's how you get this big on antipsychotics. Junk food and carbs, which is just cheap and plentiful around me. So I would like to leave my house and just lose some weight. And to do that, I would like to go to the store and buy some vegetables, please. But you don't have to do anything. I'm not asking you to. I'm not begging. I'll figure it out on my own. Much pleasure, Jay.
Hey, people, take a listen to the Divergent Mind podcast. You get both insight into living with a serious mental illness and get to listen to a lovely tale about a journey cute little animals need to take. Don't miss out, and remember, divergent minds don't need to think alike.